Thanks very much, and thanks for the invite. I came at the very last minute. My office is actually very close, so it's easy for me to step in. I've been obsessed with renewable energy for over 20 years. Firstly in wind, but wind obviously is noisy, inefficient. No, I'm joking. It's good. But solar power, for us, is clearly the way forward. And the statement there about it being the #1 power source, we'll back it up with some facts. We believe truly that in the 21st century, solar power will be the dominant power source, and I'll show you why. What is Solar Power Europe? We're the European association based here in Brussels. We represent over 200 companies along the solar value chain. I see, in fact, some of our members in the audience today, including Francois, who's an active member of our organization, and you see some of the other companies listed there. I'm also the elected chairman of the Global Solar Council, which is the international association representing solar power. Here we have membership of associations from all around the world, the major markets, and through them we represent over 2,000 companies active in the solar value chain. So solar disruption. Disruption is taking place. It's highly innovative, highly dynamic, and happening very fast, and fitting very well to the topic we're discussing today about crowdsourcing. And in fact, our organization, Solar Power Europe, is one of the partners in a European Commission-funded project, which is Crowdfund Res, which is looking to accelerate the financing of solar power through crowdfunding. I've listed here the 6 main reasons for the disruption. One is it's cheap and getting cheaper. I'll show exactly how cheap it is today. If you were looking and comparing and analyzing whether you should invest in solar power 2 years ago compared to today, it's significantly different. Second is highly versatile and fast to deploy, from the smallest scale right up to utility scale. It has significant local social economic benefits, so jobs, local capacity building. It's extremely powerful within the solar power, and also a hedge against future electricity price. There is no fuel cost, so we know the price long term, fixed over 20 years, normal installation. And finally, it's clean, so climate is a driver. So both locally, in terms of local particulates, but also globally in terms of CO2, it's a strong driver. Now, there is a tipping point taking place as we transition. The energy transition is taking place. The question mark in the previous slide was, have we reached the tipping point or not? I mean, we're convinced we have. I read an article just yesterday saying that economics trumps policy, because we believe that Trump, whatever he does, will struggle to stop the energy transition towards a cleaner and more sustainable future. And economics is really the reason, and I'll show you that. This shows, for the first time since the start of the Industrial Revolution, really, that the investments in traditional fossil fuels is starting to decrease. Now, you could argue that's to do with the oil price dropping, but there's more to it than that. Renewables now, in terms of investment, total investment, are outstripping investments in fossil fuel, new fossil fuel generation. And you see it here, the growth in installations is now at 53% of installation globally are renewables. Obviously, it's not firm capacity, they're not generating all the time. So in terms of capacity, they're lower, and in terms of the overall generation, it's 10%. But what you do see is strong growth over the last few years, and that growth will accelerate. And in terms of installed capacity, so the actual power plants being put into the ground, what you see in the European Union last year is wind and solar dominated. In terms of net new capacity, wind and solar were almost the only net new capacity built in Europe. You see coal and gas there in red decommissioning with some new build, but wind and solar with significant new build. And what does this mean in terms of energy consumption? This is globally. This is a US Department of Energy slide. The liquids, okay, that's transport, really, the blue line, but then you see in brown coal peaking now. You see natural gas peaking shortly afterwards, nuclear staying quite constant, but renewables in green has dramatic growth. And then on new markets, and this is what Adam referred to earlier about, okay, there are changes going on in the UK, not that I'm proud of, in the US. And there's changes going on within the energy sector, and more specifically in solar. What you see here is in 2010, Europe dominated. So in blue, we had over 75% of the installed capacity globally in Europe. So we're a true leader in that sector. But within a space of just 4 years, 5 years, we're now down to 16%. Now we could say, okay, that's bad news for Europe. But what it is good news for is the planet. This diversification of markets. So there's US, Japan, China, but then also the rest of the world at the top. This diversification gives a very strong platform for growth going forward and some sort of security that this is not going away. This diversification will continue. Those emerging markets that you see in next slide, I don't know if you can read them all, but basically there is a very sunny forecast for most markets. And if I highlight, for example, India over the next 4 years has 63% growth. Mexico, 114%, and Brazil, 150% growth over the next 4 years. So these are significant growth. And the one that's reigning there, Japan, I mean, it's 13%. I mean, most industries will be satisfied with 13% growth rate over the next 4 years. It's because it starts from a very high base. And finally, probably the most important disruptor or driver is the economics. And here, this is Carbon Tracker's forecast of where the prices will go. So 2016, this is what they thought it would be. It's actually there, which is solar and wind just below gas and coal. And their forecast for 2020, you see solar and wind are significantly cheaper than both gas and coal. So I'm going to touch on this a bit more now, about the cost of energy, because we believe it is one of, if not the most important driver. This is a very simplified virtuous circle or a spiral of cost reduction. More solar is installed, the prices go down, more people will install solar, and so it goes, and the price decreases. And this, in a mathematical view, is exactly how it looks. So the more you build, so the economies of scale, the cheaper it gets, and you see that it's following very closely what would be a traditional learning curve reduction in cost. And in fact, it's reduced by over 80% in the last 6 years. So since 2009, it's reduced 80% and will continue to fall by 10% a year for the foreseeable future, for the next 6 years or so. And here's the result in terms of electricity price. So when there's tenders put out by a government, these are the results, and it's comparing wind and solar. So these are published figures across the world between 2012 and today, and over the last 4 years you see a drop, a significant drop, to the point where now those on the right in the table are the latest figures of the recent tenders, down to $24 per megawatt hour, which is in fact, I mean, it's below, way below the retail electricity price in Europe. So these are figures are for plants that will be built in the coming years, and we see this trend continuing. And a very simplified graph of onshore wind and solar PV over the last 7 or 8 years. Wind is dropping in price, but you see solar PV has dropped significantly more. And here against gas, coal, and nuclear, I think this is a very relevant slide to show both the impact of solar and wind has on conventional fossil fuels and how it competes, but also the impact of the cost of capital. So the 3 yellow bars indicate 10%, 6%, and 3% weighted average cost of capital, which means how much it costs you to get the money to invest in the project. The higher the cost of the capital, the higher the cost of the electricity at the end. It has a significant effect on the electricity price. And we're trying to reduce that electricity price through reducing risk, reducing the cost of capital, and at the end, helping the consumer. But what you see there is when it's a low cost of capital and high radiation, so very sunny region, it is way below the cost of gas, coal, and nuclear. And these are figures from 2014, so it'll be even more dramatic now. And here, the cost of installation, so if you want to install it on your house, if you did it in 2009, it's $5,000 per kilowatt. If you do it now, it's below $1,000 a kilowatt, and continuing. And this is in the US, where the US has probably 10, 20% or even more in terms of legal costs on top of what we do in Europe. As you can imagine, the US, they have a very litigious or very legal approach to anything. But even in projects, the lawyers add on cost to what are quite traditional projects. And where is this going to go? I mean, we forecast here to 2050. This is the German government estimate to 2050, where it drops in all of those regions between 1.6 and 5. That's dollar cents per kilowatt. No, so that's euro cents per kilowatt hour. So way below retail electricity price. And you see the dramatic drop over those years going forward. And now the growth going forward, and this is, I think, the opportunity for project developers, but also for crowdfunding. Any innovative financing scheme has huge opportunity to invest now in solar. For the next, and I'll show it up to 2050, the growth is enormous. Huge potential for businesses. However, having said that, a lot of the growth is dependent on policy certainty. One of the biggest obstacles or drivers for solar power development is policy and regulation. We need strong but stable regulatory frameworks. And here, if you see our forecast, this is a Solar Power Europe forecast to 2020 of global installations. The difference between the lowest and the highest is 60 gigawatts, which is approximately 60 coal-fired power stations worth. 60 compared to the highest, which is 120. The difference is almost exclusively down to the policy support. If we have that support, if the market is designed correctly, we'll get 120. If it's not, we'll get 60. And there you see in Europe the effect on the contribution towards electricity. Again, if the support is there and stable, we'll get to 15%. If it's not, we'll get to 10% of contribution of electricity in Europe by 2030. This is another DOE US Department of Energy slide showing not only the growth of solar, but also batteries. And although we believe storage is not vital or not obligatory at the moment, it will become more and more important because obviously the sun doesn't shine at night, the wind doesn't blow all the time, and we do need to have, when penetration levels are high, some way of managing demand, so through smart demand management, and storage. And so you hear, for example, the batteries, they forecast an enormous growth in batteries, overtaking in terms of the gigawatts, overtaking solar. And so their global total capacity of solar by 2030, they estimate at 5,000 gigawatts. That's 5,000 coal-fired power stations by 2030 for solar. And there, what does that represent? If you have the 5,000, you get to about 15% of global electricity being provided by solar. Now, if you combine that with solar, you combine that with wind, biomass, hydro, wave, there's 15 or 16 different renewable energy technologies, you can start seeing we can get to 100% power, so electricity from renewables by 2040, 2050. And this is the IEA, so these are our figures just to show this is the fossil fuel-backed International Energy Agency, traditionally very conservative. They also show 5,000 gigawatts of solar PV in that time frame. And finally, this is if you like, the number one power source slide. Why is solar, why do we think it's going to be the number one? I mean, this is a Bloomberg New Energy Finance graph. And as you see, by 2022, the new installations of power globally will be dominated by solar. So they forecast 100 gigawatts, so 100 coal-fired power stations every year being installed in solar. Fossil fuels decreasing and wind at 50. And you see how the yellow bar, the solar, grows over time. So 21st century will belong to solar, along with the other renewables. We truly believe that. Thank you for your time. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's open up a question here. Questions? Emmerich, and then there, and there. Is that on?
What?
Yes.
Thank you very much. We often talk about externalities, like if you have a nuclear power plant, there is a lot of energy and pollution made by producing the fuel and then basically storage and etc. About solar panels, have you thought about the actually energy balance of the panel, like the energy spent to produce the panel versus the energy produced by the panel itself over the lifespan of the panel? and whether it is positive or negative? And have you ever kind of got it in your curves?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I mean, if we included externalities in the curves, you'd see, I mean, the true externalities, so I'm talking about mining for coal, building of power stations, the pollution afterwards. If you include all those, the cost of fossil fuels, I mean, you know, far higher than you see them here. In terms of the energy balance, clearly it's positive. I mean, for both solar and wind. So solar, I don't have the figure, but I don't know if Sonia, do you have the figure for? But it's, I mean, it's about a year for the payback, the energy payback, and the plant lasts 20 years. Yeah, for wind, it's about 7 months. So the payback is 7 months. Financially, obviously, the payback is longer, but from an energy balance point of view, how much energy it took to build. So yeah, wind slightly less than a year, solar about a year. So yeah, it's clearly positive.
Okay, Emmerich?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I was just wondering in terms of raw materials, because if you say that the 21st century is going to be almost exclusively, I mean, very much about solar energy, what kind of limitations do we have in terms of raw materials? Because we need to build all these plants, and I guess that for any kind of installation, we will face a number of limitations in this respect.
Yeah, sure. I mean, no is the answer. We will not. I mean, the raw material for PV panels is sand, is silicon. I mean, you know, at its base. There is a limitation in how you convert that silicon into, you know, high-grade electronic silicon. In wind turbines, they have or had or and still have to a certain extent an issue with rare earth material, rare earth metals, but that's going away. They're designing those out of their systems. But in PV, we don't face that same problem. I mean, where there's the need for silver paste or other high-grade or high-cost material, we're designing those out to a certain extent, or they form a very small part of the components.
Okay, thanks.
Dan, you want to take the question, and then I'll have that gentleman here. Don't worry.
Thank you. I just have a question about the proportions that you showed that Europe used to lead. You showed about 60 or 70%, and now about 15. And I was a bit confused because recently you did a big celebration about the 100 gigawatt here in Europe, and then we compared, and I saw that it was about twice as much as in the States, and we had the impression it was about half of global solar power. So what am I missing in the calculation?
Yeah, so the 100 gigawatts was the total installed capacity that we have now.
It's the installed capacity compared to the actual production.
Yeah. And at the moment, the annual installations, if I showed you a graph of installations in Europe annually, it peaks and then drops. I mean, now we're significantly lower than we were in 2012 instead of annual installations, how much we're actually installing each year. The total is high because of the past, but now we've stopped. And now our lobbying is to say, okay, we need to regain our leadership position, which is not in terms of sitting on what we had before. It's about building new capacity each year. And so that's the difference. And now US and China are each year installing many more megawatts than we are.
Last question here.
Hi. I just clear up one thing. Just like a lot of people in this room, I don't want the fossil fuel energy, coal, oil. But I also don't want to go from one bad situation to another. And I'm sure over the last few months, a lot of people have been watching TV, what's been happening to the Native Americans in Dakota with regards to the oil pipelines. But it's not just for oil that the company is mining. It's for minerals as well. This thing happens in Peru, happened in Brazil last year. That's why Dilma looked shocked, but actually she knew what was going on. And it happens in a religious forest, religions relevant to my community as well. And the thing is that minerals, of which all the rare earths, everything is a rare earth. Everything under the soil is rare earth. My question is that the lithium, of which there is the largest supply, which is under the soil of Afghanistan, of which there's $1 trillion worth. Look at what we've done to Afghanistan to get this sustainable material for solar panels. We've invaded and we've destroyed the country from the west to get our energy source. Is that sustainable feasible? No, it isn't, not at all. And I think we need to have a really fully open discussion about minerals as has been purported by the Club of Rome, who endorsed a book written about peak minerals. And if we don't discuss this, I think we're going to end up in a massive problem 10 years ago, that peak minerals is already here now. And even if we get the minerals from abroad, it's not going to be possible to import it. But what are your thoughts on that? Are we actually having a fully open discussion about minerals? And renewable energy is not, in terms of the materials, is not fully circular. Not at all. Sorry to say this, but this is the truth.
No, I mean, I agree. I mean, it's... I mean, the pragmatic reality is we need electricity. You know, we're not going to turn all the lights off and go back to the dark ages. I mean, I don't think anybody wants to do that. So there is a choice. You know, if you want electricity, you have to make choices. There is no perfect solution. I'm not standing here saying solar is, you know, is perfect. But we are working towards that through recycling programs. We have a PV cycle program which aims to come close to 100% recycling of the panels, to reuse all the materials. And all the module manufacturers are signing up to that, to enter into that. And in terms of the peak minerals, I'm not an expert in that at all, but of course we should have an open and honest debate about it. I mean, my obsession and my expertise is strictly in renewable energy, but we advocate very strongly for, first of all, megawatts. I mean, what you don't produce is the most valuable, so energy efficiency first, you know, use as little power as possible, consume as little power, and the power you do consume should be as green and sustainable as possible. And that's where the debate should be, is about the power that we do produce then should be, as you say.
Well, that's another
big,
question
that's a
to a politician.
No, of course it's not. I mean, you know, I don't think anybody would agree that that's the right thing to do. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Yes.